Hello everybody. The research that I'm sharing today is part of a larger SSHRC-funded project called Governing Forced Labor in Supply Chains, or GFLC for short. And I'll just start by saying that there's various strands of this project, each of which look at a different regulatory actor or jurisdiction in this broader effort to regulate supply chains. If you're interested in looking at some of the materials that our research team has developed, I invite you to consult them at gflc.ca. But the research I'm sharing today comes from a strand of the project that is looking at Canada's efforts to combat forced labor in supply chains, and more particularly the efforts of the Canadian federal government. And what we're particularly interested in is how Canada's two most recent federal governments have constructed this wider problem of human trafficking and how they've tried to gear policy towards eliminating it. And the reason that we're interested in human trafficking policy is because there's a growing body of literature that suggests that forced labor is starting to register as a meaningful vector of human trafficking more broadly. And that's a substantial shift because right now, or at least until recently, the human trafficking debate has largely revolved around issues of sex trafficking. And scholars are very critical of this focus because essentially what this focus has done is it's constructed Canada as this good protector nation, going after these bad criminal traffickers. And that's been very detrimental to migrant workers, to legitimate sex workers. And it's also, from the perspective of our project, it's minimized efforts to identify the legal drivers of forced labor. So we were certainly interested in seeing if there was a discursive shift in the Canadian context, but more specifically, we wanted to see what the solutions to forced labor actually looked like. And there's a number of documents that we examined. We think that the clearest distillation of recent human trafficking policy can be narrowed down to three documents in particular. And I'm going to try to just really quickly sketch the broader policy and political context that these documents come from. So first is the 2012 National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. And this was developed by the conservative government of Stephen Harper in Canada, who was elected in 2006. And it's worth noting that the language and the recommendations contained in this document rely very heavily on a particular United Nations protocol. And that is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And that was ratified by a number of UN member states in the year 2000. And I'm going to just refer to it as the Palermo Protocol. That's where it was ratified, and that title is much shorter. And so the Palermo Protocol is part of a broader UN-led effort to combat organized crime. So obviously, the language that it's using, the solutions that it's proposing are based around enhancing law enforcement and prosecutorial powers to go after sex trafficking rings. The second document is called A Call to Action, Ending the Use of All Forms of Child Labor in Supply Chains. And this was published in 2018 by two parliamentary groups here in Canada. And it marks a pretty significant shift in the discourse. This is where you see multinational corporations starting to be recognized as a driver of forced labor, particularly in global supply chains, and even more specifically, drivers of illegal child labor in the global south. And I think that we can best identify the policy influences on this document in a number of modern slavery laws that were being implemented in UN member states around the same time. So Jonelle identified a number of these. There was the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015. You have the French Corporate Duty of Vigilance Law in 2017, and then Australia's Modern Slavery Act in 2018. And again, that's significant because what it's doing is it's identifying corporate capitalism as a driver of forced labor. And lastly, we looked at the national strategy to combat human trafficking, which was published by the current government, the Trudeau Liberals, which succeeded the Harper government in 2015. And this is where we finally start to see some kind of a synthesis between trying to address sex trafficking and forced labor. We're obviously very critical of this synthesis. I can get into that in just a moment. But I will say that there is another unique policy and political influence on this document, and that is the current government's efforts at truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, particularly efforts to address missing and murdered Indigenous women. So at a glance, yes, there is definitely a discursive shift in human trafficking policy, but there's a lot more here that I think we can interrogate more effectively. And I'll outline our observations in just a second, but I want to try to justify the use of our methodology. Like, why are a bunch of structuralists using discourse analysis? Why is that helpful? Well, as it turns out, there's a number of tools in the critical discourse repertoire that not only allow us to gauge the motivations of different policy actors, but identify who is included in certain policy and who is excluded. So one tool is the identification of discursive identities and how they're strategically deployed in policy documents. I think this can best be summed up as who is trafficked, or more specifically, who does each government believe is trafficked. Next, we looked at rhetorical appeals, which is the use of language to stir up a sort of emotional response in a particular audience, generally to create some kind of buy-in for a certain policy solution. And last but certainly not least, we used the what is the problem represented to be approach, which was developed by an Australian political scientist named Carol Backey. And she sums it up herself perfectly, so I will quote from Carol Backey now. Policy is not the government's best efforts to solve problems. Rather, policies produce problems with particular meanings, and that affects what gets done or not done. Okay, so what did we find after we applied these methodologies to these documents? Well, in regards to who is trafficked, we see in the conservative plan that the language of the Palermo Protocol is very influential. So there's really no room in the document for sex to be considered a viable or legal form of work, and it's not something that women have any agency in participating in. And this is really emphasized in the language that's used in the document. There's gratuitous detail of the abuse inflicted on women in the global sex trade, and that's clearly meant to paint a picture of an idealized victim that a sort of humanitarian state needs to address. And so naturally, the solution to human trafficking proposed by the conservative plan is one that enhances police powers, locks down the border, and enhances prosecutorial abilities to go after sex trafficking. In a call to action, the question of who is trafficked is very different. Instead, it's children in the global south who are identified as the at most risk group of recruitment for illegal child labor. And that's usually done by opportunistic corporations who are looking for a cheap but reliable labor pool. And I will say that our analysis of this document found a strikingly similar use of rhetoric. So for instance, the readers consistently reminded of the innocence of children, their lack of power, and the fact that these are betrayed by unscrupulous corporations. And so the solution, according to a call to action, is to implement something akin to a modern slavery law. In the liberal strategy, we see an effort to kind of synthesize these two approaches. So there's a focus on who is most at risk of being trafficked. the efforts at truth and reconciliation, addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women, influences this document by saying that it's Indigenous women that are the most at risk of being sex trafficked. But the influence of a call to action is also very palpable because we see that there's at least some recognition that multinational corporations are drivers of child labor. The rhetoric is obviously very similar. The victims of sex trafficking are not afforded any agency. Sex isn't considered work. It's not considered a viable form of employment. It's viewed through a criminal lens. And you would think that the influence of a call to action would make the recognizance of corporate recruitment strategies a little bit more palpable, but we went through the document and there's really only one mention of forced labor, and it pertains to an instance of abuse in Canada's temporary foreign worker program. So even then, the forced labor, the conditions of forced labor are chalked up to a criminal element within an otherwise legitimate recruitment drive. And so the solution obviously is to try and strengthen the justice system, but also implement some form of corporate regulation. But it's pretty clear from our analysis that a criminal justice reform approach is favored over corporate regulation. Okay, so where does this leave us, and what are the implications? Well, obviously, there is a discursive shift from sex trafficking to forced labor, but sex trafficking remains the dominant frame. And we speculate that one of the reasons for this is the fact that sex isn't widely considered a legitimate form of labor. There's an excellent recent intervention in the Journal of Human Trafficking by Elia Durrison and Emily Vandermeulen that talks about sexualized nationalism. And that's a politics that pervades a number of UN member states. And its role is to construct anti-trafficking nations as the moral rescuers of those in the sex trade. But also, the policy solutions presented by the sex trafficking frame and the forced labor frame are markedly very different. And I think what can best be used to understand them is a distinction between hard and soft policy solutions. So you look at the lengthy jail time, the deportations, the border security that's proposed by the sex trafficking frame, and you compare that to the solutions to forced labor recommended in these modern slavery laws. I'll refer to Janelle's very excellent analysis here about why those proposals don't stack up, particularly compared to a much harder policy solution. So with all of this in mind, we stress that there's a need for a broader experimental approach to addressing human trafficking, because the criminal justice approach has not worked, but neither clearly have modern slavery laws. They both have significant shortcomings, and they're not addressing the root of the problem in either position. So there's a lot more to be said, but I think I'm going to leave it there for the sake of time, and thank you very much.